October 1957, Calcasieu Parish, Louisiana. The air was thick with the coming cool, a dampness that promised winter rains and the end of the long, suffocating heat. It was a month of settling accounts, of tallying the rice harvest, of looking toward the quiet, fallow months ahead. It was a time for prudence. Elodie Broussard, a widow of 48 years, did not act with prudence. She acted with something that looked, to everyone else, like the sharp and sudden unraveling of a mind. She took her husband's rifle from the tall cabinet in the hall. The cabinet he had built with his own hands, from sinker cypress, pulled from the Calcasieu River. The wood was dark, almost black, and cool to the touch. The rifle was not. It held a residual warmth, a memory of a grip. It was a Winchester Model 70, pre-war, chambered in .30-06 Springfield. The walnut stock was a deep, rich brown, oiled to a satin sheen over 30 years of careful handling by one man, her Jean-Pierre. There was a small, pale scratch near the bolt, a story she knew involving a panicked 10-point buck and a barbed wire fence near Indian Bayou. The bluing on the barrel was perfect, save for one spot at the muzzle where it had worn to a soft gray. It was a beautiful thing, a useful thing, an object of profound and practical value. It was a tool for putting meat on the table. It was a line of defense. It was $300 of liquid capital in a parish where cash was often scarce and credit was king. It was the last, most potent symbol of the man who was gone. Elodie wrapped it in a clean wool blanket, the gray one from the foot of their bed, and placed it in the passenger seat of her husband's dusty Ford F-100. She drove the 10 miles into Lake Charles, the truck's engine a familiar, rumbling complaint. She did not drive to the gunsmith. She did not drive to the pawn shop. She drove to the courthouse, a brick edifice of imposing local authority, its halls smelling of floor wax and old paper. She met a man named Silas Croft on the steps. Silas Croft was a man who dealt in land. He bought parcels nobody wanted, tax-delinquent lots, forgotten slivers between properties, tracts of swampland deemed unimprovable by the parish assessor. He bought them for pennies on the dollar and waited. Sometimes a new road went through. Sometimes a company needed a right-of-way. Sometimes he could sell a useless piece to an unsuspecting buyer from out of state. He was not a farmer. He was not a rancher. He was a speculator, a man whose profit came from the margins of other people's misfortunes or oversights. He was wearing a clean but frayed suit jacket and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He saw the blanket-wrapped rifle in Elodie Broussard's arms. He knew its worth. He knew her situation. A recent widow, a small farm to run alone, the look of a person unmoored. They went inside, to the clerk's office. The papers were already drawn up. Silas Croft was efficient. The transaction was recorded in the thick, leather-bound ledger of Calcasieu Parish. A deed transfer. Elodie Broussard, grantee. Silas Croft, grantor. The property in question was designated as Lot 7B, Section 14, a tract of 80 acres bordering the murky, slow-moving waters of a nameless bayou that fed into the West Fork of the Calcasieu River. Its official assessment was negligible. Its practical value was zero. It was swamp. Not good marshland for trapping, not riverfront for a camp. Just 80 acres of stagnant water, cypress knees, water moccasins, and mosquitoes. It was a place that flooded every spring and baked into a malarial soup every summer. The good cypress had been logged out 60 years prior by a timber company from Michigan. What was left was scrub tupelo, water oak, and the skeletal remains of ancient giants. The agreed-upon price was $1 for legal purposes. The actual price was the Winchester Model 70. The clerk, a cousin of her late husband's, stamped the deed with a heavy, final thud. He did not meet her eyes. He looked at the paper. He looked at Silas Croft's triumphant smirk. He looked at the floor. He saw a woman trading the last vestige of her husband's strength for 80 acres of rot. Silas Croft took the rifle, still in its wool shroud. He cradled it like a prize. He had traded a recurring tax liability and a worthless piece of geography for one of the finest hunting rifles ever made. He had made a good deal. He had, in the parlance of the parish, skinned a widow. He felt no shame in it. Business was business. Grief made people do strange things. Elodie Broussard took her copy of the deed. The paper was crisp. The ink was dark. She folded it once and put it in her purse. She walked out of the courthouse and drove home. She did not look back. The news traveled the way news does in a small parish. It traveled on telephone party lines. It traveled over the counters of hardware stores. It traveled through the pews of the church on Sunday. It was a piece of gossip so pure, so perfectly illustrative of human folly, that it became an instant local legend. The men of the county had one word for it: grief. At the feed store in Sulphur, the men gathered on Saturday mornings. They sat on sacks of sweet feed and cottonseed meal, the air thick with the smell of earth and molasses. They talked about the weather, the price of rice, the high school football team. And they talked about Elodie Broussard. They shook their heads. A fine rifle like that. A pre-war Model 70. A man could take any deer in the parish with a rifle like that. A man could feel safe with a rifle like that in the house. To trade it for a patch of mud and snakes. It was a sin against practicality. It was an insult to the memory of Jean-Pierre, who had been a practical man above all else. They said it was the grief. It had addled her. It had clouded her judgment. A woman alone, they reasoned, could not be expected to understand the value of things, the value of a good rifle, the negative value of a bad piece of land. They said Silas Croft should be ashamed, but they said it with a grudging respect. Croft had seen an opportunity. He had acted. That they understood. What they could not understand was Elodie. The women of the parish had a different word for it, but it meant the same thing: pity. In the parking lot of Our Lady of Prompt Succor after Mass, they gathered in their Sunday dresses, their voices low and concerned. They saw Elodie getting into her truck alone. They noted her quietness, her solitude. They had brought her casseroles and condolences in the weeks after the funeral. Now they brought whispers and worried glances. They spoke of the rifle as a legacy, an heirloom to be passed to a son, if she had had one, a tangible piece of the man she had lost. To give it away felt like a second death, a deliberate erasure. And for what? For a place you couldn't even walk through without sinking to your knees in mud? A place that bred sickness. They pitied her loneliness. They pitied her confusion. They saw the transaction not as a business deal, but as a cry for help, a desperate, irrational act by a woman overwhelmed by loss. They resolved to bring her another casserole. The conventional wisdom was a fortress. It was built of generations of common sense. Land had value if you could plant it, graze it, or build on it. Rice fields had value. An acre of good pasture for cattle had value, maybe $50. An acre of pine timberland had value. An acre of swamp had the value of the taxes you had to pay on it every year. It was a liability, a hole in your pocket. Elodie's 80 acres were especially worthless. The parish records showed 2 separate attempts in the 1920s to drain the parcel for farming. Both had failed. The water always returned. A survey from 1946 noted its unsuitability for any development due to the unstable soil and seasonal flooding. It was, in the cold, hard language of the assessor's office, a piece of nothing. The rifle, on the other hand, was something. It was a known quantity. In 1957, a new Winchester Model 70 cost around $120. A pre-war model in the condition of Jean-Pierre's was a collector's item even then. It could fetch $150, maybe $200 from the right buyer. $200 was a fortune. It was 2 months' wages for a laborer at the new chemical plants. It was enough to buy a good used tractor. It was enough to pay off debts, to buy seed for the next season, to fix the leaking roof on the barn. It was security. Elodie Broussard had traded security for a mosquito nursery. She had traded a masterpiece of mechanical engineering for 80 acres of primordial ooze. The parish settled on its explanation. It was simple. It was sad. It was final. The widow Broussard had lost her mind. The swamp was her monument to grief. And then time passed. 1 year, 2 years, 6 years. The story of the rifle and the swamp faded from a current event into a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale told to illustrate the dangers of sentiment and the sharp practices of men like Silas Croft. Croft himself had done well. He sold the rifle for a handsome profit to a collector in Houston. He used the money to buy more marginal land. He prospered. Elodie Broussard did not, or so it seemed. She paid the small property tax on her 80 acres every year. She was seen from time to time walking the edges of her property, not in the daze of a mourner, but with a strange, quiet purpose. She spent months building a narrow boardwalk out of salvaged cypress planks, a rickety-looking path that snaked out over the black water and disappeared into the dense canopy of tupelo and cypress trees. The men at the feed store heard about the boardwalk. They chuckled. Now she was building a road to nowhere in her swamp of sorrow. The women at the church heard about it. They sighed. Poor Elodie, still wandering in her grief, making a private place to mourn where no one could see. She bought books, not novels, not magazines, books from the University Extension Service, books on botany, books on hydrology, books on apiculture. This no one knew. This she did quietly. In the spring of 1964, a new sight appeared on the Broussard farm. Stacked near the barn were dozens of wooden boxes, freshly built and painted a stark, clean white. Beehives. The parish noticed. This was a new chapter in the story of Elodie's eccentricity. First the swamp, now bees. It was one thing to have a few hives for your own table. It was another to build an apiary, Beekeeping was a fussy, difficult business, with little profit in it. The local honey was mostly from clover and tallow trees, dark and strong, worth little at the market. Elodie loaded the hives onto a flatbed trailer, 2 at a time, and pulled them with the old Ford truck down the dirt track that led to her swamp. She used a small boat, a pirogue, to ferry the hives, one by one, out to small platforms she had built along her boardwalk, deep within the 80 acres. The work was slow, hot, and punishing. The mosquitoes were relentless. The humidity was a physical weight. She worked alone, a solitary figure in a wide-brimmed hat, moving with a steady, unhurried rhythm. The parish watched from a distance and shook its collective head. The poor woman, working so hard for nothing. The summer of 1964 was long and brutally hot. The tupelo trees in Elodie's swamp bloomed. For 2 weeks the air was filled with a sweet, cloying scent and the frantic, deafening hum of millions of bees. The tiny greenish-white blossoms of the water tupelo, the Nyssa aquatica, dripped nectar. Elodie waited. She watched the water levels. She watched the bees. She consulted her books. In the early fall, she harvested the honey. She did not sell it at the local market. She did not take it to the grocery store in Lake Charles. She bottled it in small, clean glass jars. She typed a simple white label for each one. The label said, Broussard Pure Tupelo Honey, Calcasieu Parish, Louisiana. She sent a dozen jars to a specialty food distributor in New Orleans she had read about. She sent another dozen to a professor of agriculture at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, whose paper on native flora she had studied. Weeks passed. Nothing happened. The parish's judgment seemed secure. Elodie's folly had simply found a new, more laborious expression. Then a letter arrived. It was from the professor at LSU. It contained a detailed chemical analysis of her honey sample. He was effusive. The fructose-to-glucose ratio was remarkably high, he wrote. This meant the honey would not crystallize. It would remain a smooth, liquid gold indefinitely. The flavor profile was unique, he noted, buttery and complex, with a faint green note he had never encountered. He asked if she had more. He wanted to study it further. A week later, a telegram came from the distributor in New Orleans. They were a purveyor of fine foods for the city's best restaurants and wealthiest families. They had never tasted anything like it. Their clients were enchanted. They wanted to order 200 pounds immediately. They were prepared to pay $1.50 per pound. $1.50 per pound. The best local clover honey sold for 30 cents a pound. Elodie Broussard read the telegram. She sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had sat with Jean-Pierre for 30 years, and she did the math. Her first small harvest had been nearly 400 pounds. She wrote back to the distributor. She agreed to the price. The next year, she doubled the number of hives. The year after that, she doubled it again. Her boardwalks grew more extensive. Her operation became more efficient. The checks from New Orleans, and then from Baton Rouge, and then from Houston and Atlanta grew larger. The Broussard farm began to change. The old Ford truck was replaced by a new Chevrolet. The farmhouse got a new roof and a fresh coat of white paint. A new, modern processing shed was built next to the barn, all stainless steel and gleaming equipment. She hired 2 men from the parish to help her, paying them a good wage. The parish began to talk again, but this time the words were different. The laughter was gone. The pity had evaporated. In its place was a new word: awe. The men at the feed store no longer talked about her grief. They talked about her luck. They talked about the strange, unpredictable ways of the world. They tried to understand what had happened. Tupelo honey? They knew the tree, a worthless soft wood that grew in the swamps. Who would have thought its flowers produced liquid gold? It had to be luck, a blind stumble into a fortune. The women at the church saw her resilience transformed into success. They praised her hard work. They saw her quiet confidence. They no longer saw a victim of grief, but a pillar of the community, a businesswoman, an employer. They retroactively rewrote the story. They decided they had always known she was a strong woman, that her strange purchase of the swamp must have been part of a plan they simply couldn't see at the time. And Silas Croft? Silas Croft heard the stories. At first he dismissed them. A little honey money, a trifle. But the stories grew. He saw Elodie's new truck in town. He saw the construction at her farm. He saw the freight trucks with logos from out-of-state shipping companies turning down her road. He went to the grocery store in Lake Charles. He saw a small display of her honey. It was in a fancy tall jar with an elegant label. The price was $4 for a 12-ounce jar. He did the math. The price per pound was staggering. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He drove out past her property. He couldn't see much from the road, just the well-kept farmhouse and the new buildings. But he could feel it, the hum of activity, the aura of prosperity. A prosperity built on the 80 acres of worthless mud he had traded for a rifle. He thought of the rifle. He had sold it for $210, a profit of $210. Elodie Broussard was making that much every few hours during the harvest season. He was a man who prided himself on seeing value where others saw none. He had looked at that 80-acre parcel and seen only a tax burden. He had seen mud, snakes, and rot. He had failed to see the one thing that mattered. He had failed to see the bloom. The story of his clever trade, the one he had told with a smirk for years, was now told with a different ending. It was no longer a story of his shrewdness. It was the story of his blindness. He, Silas Croft, the sharpest land trader in Calcasieu Parish, had been the fool. He had traded a diamond mine for a pocket knife. His reputation was ruined. Not in a legal or financial sense. He still had his money, his other properties, but his authority was gone. The grudging respect he had commanded was replaced by quiet ridicule. He became a living punchline, the man who couldn't see the gold for the trees. The sting of this public humiliation was worse than any financial loss. It ate at him. It soured his every other deal. It followed him into the bank, the courthouse, the diner. He was no longer the clever fox. He was the man who gave away the honeypot. The swamp, that worthless, unimprovable tract, was now the most productive 80 acres in the parish. More productive than the best rice field, more profitable than the richest pasture. All because of a specific confluence of factors. The unique water chemistry of that particular bayou, the dense, ancient stand of Nyssa aquatica, and the vision of one woman who knew what to look for. Years later, when a journalist from a national magazine came to write a story about this unlikely agricultural success, he asked Elodie Broussard the question the whole parish had been asking for a decade. How did she know? Everyone assumed she had just gotten lucky, that she bought the swamp in a fit of grief and stumbled upon its secret by accident. They were wrong. It wasn't grief. It wasn't luck. It was a memory. The journalist sat with her in her simple, clean kitchen. She was an old woman now, her hands gnarled from work, but her eyes still clear and sharp. She poured him a cup of coffee and a small dish of her famous honey. The sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the golden liquid. She told him about her father. He had